Welcome to another edition of EverybodyHatesCleveland.com, the podcast, episode 49. I am your host, Jim Pete, from Everybody Hates Cleveland. Joining me, so here's the story. I was walking down the street, and I looked across the street, and I see this guy, and he looks familiar to me, and I couldn't believe my eyes. There, standing across the street, is Paul Cousineau from the None of that really happened. I do absolutely have Paul Cousineau with me today. Those of you that don't know who he is, which is probably nobody, but if you don't know who he is, there's a website still online called the Diatribe, run today by Al Chimichella, but formerly, you're kind of like Prince, Paul. The former artist of the Diatribe, Paul Cousineau, has joined us. Paul, we talked off air about where you've been the past 5 years. I'm not going to force this upon the listener, but how are you doing these days? There's a lot of people who follow the Diatribe still and read your stuff from the past. How's Paul Cousineau doing today?
I'm doing very well, Jim. Thank you. I have been hiding in plain sight here on the west side of Cleveland, down at the Indians games when I can get down there when coaching baseball doesn't interfere with that. But just took a step away a couple of years ago, and although most people thought that there was no way I was going to truly take a step away, given the amount of time and words that I spent talking about the tribe and writing about the tribe, I had to just kind of make a clean break and took a step away and asked Al to take over the site for as much as or as little as he could, which is perfectly fine by me. And it's been great. I mean, it's nice to continue to watch the Indians. It's also nice not to, as I said to you on a Saturday night, be sitting there pounding out 2,500 words of a lazy Sunday while my wife sits there and watches a movie, and she's like, "So, who are you writing this for?" I'm like, "Leave me alone. Just leave me alone." But no, it's going well.
Yeah, I still get those looks every now and then from my wife. The eye rolling that I get is beyond belief. Like, why are you still writing about this team? I mean, it's not like we're writing about the Yankees here. We're writing about the Indians who haven't won a World Series ever. So it is kind of funny when you stop and think about it. But I think my goal here was to, in some form or fashion, bring you back kind of into the mix. And I know this isn't a regular thing by any stretch, but it certainly is good to have you on here, Paul, and we can kind of maybe flesh out some things and maybe every once in a while pull you onto the podcast here and get your thoughts. As you know, we've kind of kept in touch over the past few years via the email. Perhaps maybe every couple of months we can pull you in here and get your thoughts on something big that's going on. Of course, the only thing big that's going on right now is rainouts, but I digress. We do still have a lot to talk about. We haven't heard your take in many, many years. So there's lots of avenues we can go. But I do want to start off with kind of the roster of this current team. I don't know how much you've been paying attention, but I know you're still an Indians fan. So I know you're at least casting an eye out on this roster. And, over the years, the Indians have done kind of what the Indians do. They haven't really gone out and made a big splash move. And when they have made the quote-unquote splash moves, they brought in Swisher and Bourne, heralded at the time. But, of course, that's kind of dwindled away. This roster is kind of built on, when you were writing regularly, Paul, we couldn't really develop anybody, but it does seem to have this kind of roster filled with these players that they've developed, as well as these kind of $6 million men that they've brought in.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, it's an interesting thing. For a long time we sat there and wondered why couldn't they, develop their own players and, complained about John Mirabelli and, everything else that we kvetched about. And now, you look around the roster and there's legitimate pieces and not just little complimentary pieces, but there's legitimate pieces on there that came up through the system that were drafted that, the arms may have come via trade, but it's not like we ever traded for any of these guys. And other than maybe Carrasco, that they were these really highly touted prospects. And, everybody kind of had to get used to the idea that Carrasco was going to take a little bit of time to develop. But, they've put this thing together. And as you said, they added a little bit with, the Uribes and the Rajay Davises and pieces like that. But it's an interesting mix of players in terms of sometimes I couldn't figure out whether this offseason exactly what they were doing to try to augment the offense or if they were, going full bore on the defense, with Naquin or Cowgill or things like that. But they're kind of caught in the middle. I don't know how much that has to do with Brantley's injury or Chisenhall not being there, but they're in kind of a weird place, and it's going to be interesting to see how this develops over the next month or two in terms of who sticks and who kind of fritters away.
Well, you mentioned the outfield and Naquin and Cowgill, and as I was talking with a writer at EHC earlier today, we were talking about how funny it is at at the beginning of March we were looking at Almonte being our center fielder, Chisenhall being our right fielder, and who knows when Brantley's going to come back to be our starting left fielder. Well, here we are at the beginning of April, and Almonte's on an 80-game suspension. Chisenhall's about to start his rehab. Brantley's about to start his rehab, and we have this kind of piecemeal outfield out there with Naquin, a rookie. We've got, Rajai Davis, another old guy that they've signed. We've got Marlon Byrd, another old guy that they've signed. You've got, and then you've got Jose Ramirez kind of going out there in the Mike Aviles role, kind of overcoming the Aviles kind of hesitancy with talent. I mean, how long do you think they can make it with this duct tape outfield? And the other interesting part of this, Paul, is they didn't really make a splash move. They get Bird on the cheap in a minor league deal. They maybe went too early and got Davis as kind of a glue guy for the fourth outfielder. Did they not go after somebody because they couldn't, or did they not go after somebody because they've got guys like Clint Frazier and Bradley Zimmer, who, by the way, hit 2 home runs tonight, and Frazier with the home run tonight, but in Double-A baseball? Did they not go out and get a guy maybe long-term because they know these guys are close?
I think it's probably somewhere in the middle there, that I don't think they were going to sign somebody that was going to be, a 3-4 year deal, partly because it's the Indians and, those things just don't work out for them. Whenever they make that kind of move, they always develop a nice core, and then with the homegrown people, and then the pieces they add just don't work out. So I don't know if they're gun shy on that type of stuff or what exactly, where their minds are even at on that kind of stuff. The whether Zimmer or Frazier, how quickly they're going to come, I don't know. I mean, they're still just starting kind of off in Double-A. I know Zimmer was there for a little bit last year, but it's going to be interesting to see how aggressive they get, particularly if we, see that Marlon Byrd is not what he even once was last year, or if Cowgill is Colin Cowgill, or how they're gonna approach it. I don't know how long of a leash they're going to have on a lot of these guys. The interesting thing to me is how they're going to approach Jose Ramirez, because I thought going into the offseason, I wasn't sure that Francona was going to be that kind of willing to give him the Aviles role. I was terrified that they were going to go out and sign, some utility infielder because he wanted a veteran guy. He wanted, someone he could trust. And I was afraid that they were going to kind of send Ramirez either off to the minors or relegate him to, even lesser duty. So the way that they're using him right now is fantastic. And maybe he becomes, like that Sean Figgins, before he fell apart, or, that kind of really super utility guy that they can plug in a couple different places, because he seems to be a little bit of a Band-Aid, or, a bridge between maybe these veterans that you don't know if they're going to pan out, but the odds are that they're not going to be all-stars this year. But maybe you can kind of juggle that lineup a little bit until some of these guys start coming up. Because if you think about Urshela and Zimmer and Frazier, if you figure that those 3 guys are going to be here in the next, let's say, year and a half, those are your 3 spots in the lineup, other than first base, really, that are glaring holes if you're going to figure that Brantley's going to still hold down one of the spots in the outfield and not be moved, to first base or to some other place like that. So I think that they didn't make that big move because of those guys that are kind of sitting there. And these, Marlon Byrd, Juan Uribe moves, there are moves that we see teams make when they're kind of biding time. I think at one point, I think I wrote that they should have made a Juan Uribe signing until Lonnie Chisenhall was ready to take over third base. So that's how long we've been waiting for Lonnie, and Juan Uribe has been kind of hanging on.
Oh my God, that kind of says it all, doesn't it? I the funny thing about these signing, like the Uribe, here's what is confusing to me about Uribe, and I'm not it's not a horrible signing, don't get me wrong, but they brought Giovanni Urshela up last year. They brought him up in May. They brought him up before Lindor. It seems like they were buying in. He had some injury issues. I mean, you've been around this organization for a while, Paul. I mean, kind of shifting over to third base. You mentioned it as a glaring hole. We can get to first base in a second. Is it a surprise to you that they went to again? They went to Urshela last year in May, and now they're kind of dishing him off to the side. Do you think it's because they think he needs more time, or is this another one of those? Maybe a Francona's type deal where, as you mentioned, he does seem to like his veterans. Uribe certainly fits that bill. What scares me about Uribe, on top of all this, is he has kind of utility niche to him. He can play shortstop. He can play second base in a pinch. Is that why they brought in Uribe? Why don't they buy into Urshela yet?
I think they do buy into Urshela. I think that at the end of last year, Urshela was really scuffling, and I think that that's one of the things that for as much as you can question Francona and the way that he does rely on these veterans, I think he has shown with these young guys, he's figured out, if a guy's scuffling, if a guy's really not playing well and, starts to doubt themselves, he tries to mix it and match it, either giving them time off. I mean, who figured that Lonnie Chisenhall was all of a sudden going to be a right fielder that was running all over the place? I give him credit for that. I mean, you can complain about, and I do complain about the bunting and the, everything else that goes into it, but I think he gets these guys' psyches and how to kind of massage a lot of these guys into, being comfortable and being ready when they come up. Because if you think about when Ramirez came up or started the season or earlier last year and was a mess, they sent him down, got him right, got him hitting, and then brought him back up. I wouldn't be surprised if they did something with Urshela as long as Urshela was hitting. And I do think that there's a certain influence that Uribe has as a guy who's been around for a while. I remember when Swisher, after Swisher and Bourne went away, there was an article about how the veterans on the team that were now the leaders went into Francona's office and they kind of asked, how do we assert ourselves as leaders on this team? And they came up with some sort of contract where people signed things. And it always struck me as very awkward, like that you have to walk around with a contract to be like, hey, I'm a leader on this team. What do you guys think? You think I could be a leader on this team? It just didn't strike me as real, having a lot of leadership qualities. And you can say that that's just, Kluber and Brantley's personality, but it just kind of struck me as a strange way to kind of say, hey, everybody, can I be a leader now? Can you sign this piece of paper? And so I think that, a guy like Uribe, who's going to command the respect of the locker room, but also sit there with, Lindor and Ramirez, hopefully in his, two back pockets, to say, this is how, you are when you're a major leaguer. This is how you act. This is how you perform when you're in your big leagues. And I think that, whether that's a cultural thing or whether that's an actual clubhouse thing, I think it's not bad. If it's June and he still has, 2 extra base hits and, is hitting 150, then you jettison the guy. But for now, I'm okay with it just as a kind of bridge guy to whoever it is, Urshela.
Well, and it does seem like he is playing that role. There's been some pictures that have surfaced over the past couple of weeks with Uribe hanging out with Lindor and some of the other Hispanic players. And again, culturally, that can be a big thing in a locker room. We've got to talk about Frankie Lindor and the leadership issue. There were a lot of wonky things last year, the strange meetings and Kipnis kind of throwing himself out there. One of the things that has struck me about Francisco Lindor, and maybe this is putting too much on him as a rookie second-year player, but I think one of the things that has struck me about Francisco Lindor is he seems to bring this leadership quality to the table that the Indians maybe haven't seen in a while. Last year, there was a piece that Hayden Grove had written about the way he relates to Giovanni Urshela and how the locker room changed since Lindor has come. Could you see, maybe with Uribe kind of behind him, could you see, even though he's in his second year, really his first year, when you look at the games that he's played, could you see a scenario where Francisco Lindor, just based upon personality, kind of takes over this locker room, even though he's a younger player?
Absolutely. I think that you could see it when he came up. You can see it even at the beginning of this year, just the way that he, I don't know if he commands respect or what it is, but they certainly seem to gravitate towards him. I have a neighbor who used to run all the Indians youth camps. And so he used to have to do all these, summer camps when players would come up or they'd have, the player that would be with all the kids, and they did different drills with them. And so it was always interesting to hear these kind of anecdotal versions of these guys, not only in front of kids but also just in front of a bunch of guys,
Yeah.
that we're all former baseball players and things like that. And so I think it was 2 years ago, is they had the Tribe Fan Fest, and he was running all the little skill camps that they were doing in the bowels of Progressive Field. And after that night, he came over and we were having a couple of drinks, and he's like, I'll tell you, there was this one guy. He's like, you'd never believe, um, the the kid that kind of I was most impressed with was this Lindor kid, and he was probably 19 or 20 at the time. And I was like, all right, so what does that mean? Like, how does someone command your attention? How does he stand out from the other people? And he's like, I don't know. He's like, there was just something kind of about him that, like, I just kind of liked him, and I just kind of wanted to hang around him. He's like, I don't really know what that is. And it's this kind of indefinable, what is a leader, what are leadership qualities when it comes to baseball. But if to hear him talk about other names of players that are still on the team, he was like, it was like this 35-year-old man was in awe of this like 19-year-old kid, and just the way that he carried himself. And I think that if he picks that up, other teammates are going to pick that up. And I don't know if, again, that's something you walk around the locker room and say, hey, I think Frankie's the leader now. I think it's just something that it just happens. And Uribe kind of being his muscle, or whatever you want to call it, I don't think it's going to hurt.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, Paul, that you mentioned that. Having spent a lot of time with the Mudcats over the years, his year in Carolina, I can't tell you how many times that very conversation you just mentioned across somebody's lips that I was talking to. And the fun thing about a guy like Lindor is he just who he is. And people have asked me all the time, what do you think of Lindor? And there's that quality that you can't really put your finger on. I have honestly only seen it in a couple of players in my career. As a writer, if you want to call it such a thing. Never anybody to the extent with the talent of Francisco Lindor. And I think you got to see that surface both on the field and in the locker room. The funny thing about this Indians team is they've brought players in like Giambi. They brought Giambi in to be the guy in the locker room. And, you hear all of these odd things that players like Kipnis, and you mentioned the Brantley and Kluber contracts. And the one thing about Lindor that's intriguing to me is he backs it up on the field, but he also has this kind of effervescent personality, this professionalism. He's always the first one in, the last one out. He does all of those immeasurable things that we have been lacking in this locker room for years and years. And perhaps that's a transcendent thing that can turn this team into something more than, I guess, what we've become used to, this, 1 year on, 5 year off team, but we shall see. All right. So let's talk first base. It's been an interesting position over the years. Carlos Santana last year, Mike Napoli this year. Napoli's had a good start to the season. These guys are in the middle of our lineup. Again, Napoli, a 1 year deal, another one of those 1 year deal guys. Are you buying into Mike Napoli as an everyday player after the year he had last year? We hear about the sleep apnea stuff, and he had the surgery, and he seems another one of those locker room guys that we've been talking about maybe more than I thought we would today. Are you buying into Mike Napoli lengthening the lineup? Is this something he can continue to do, or too much too soon?
I think he can continue to do it. I think that it's probably not going to be like this, but I also don't think it's going to be like a Mark Reynolds-esque, drop off where all of a sudden you're like, gosh, Mark Reynolds is carrying the lineup, and then he's DFA'd 6 weeks later. I think that there's a higher floor, but maybe a lower ceiling. But Napoli kind of is what he is. I think he's better than he was last year. I think he's going to be a couple ticks down from what he was a couple years ago or 3 years ago. But if he can play first base and play it competently, it's going to do a lot of good for the infield defense, do a lot of good for the pitching staff. And I think that that's the one thing that scares me, is that with his history of getting injured and not making through seasons, and having these kind of downturns, that depth that we found out we didn't have in the outfield, the depth at first base is, again, Santana, who certainly has never showed any interest in learning how to play first base, and is the most nonchalant first baseman, 5'9" first baseman you've ever seen. So that kind of scares me, in that if Napoli's not that answer, then what is? Is it just kind of throwing Santana back out there, or what exactly do they do, or what do they do beyond this year? So it's going to be interesting to see what Napoli can bring over the course of a season. But for now, I mean, I don't have much of a problem. I think he'll be. I don't know if he's going to be the quintessential cleanup hitter. I don't think many people are expecting him to be that. But if he can hit 20, 25 homers, that's huge.
Yeah, and he gets on base, which gives us this intriguing kind of odd mix of guys at 4-5, and that you've got a guy like Napoli whose on base percentage historically is around 35%. And you've got, Santana who gets on base with the plum, even though the power game isn't quite what people expected. It brings me to Yan Gomes. And before I get into that, I was intrigued on Saturday with the Yan Gomes snap throw. I wrote a piece about it on Saturday, and I rarely write pieces like that. But, an interesting piece to this Napoli thing is the defense. And, he's always been a decent defender at first base. And it kind of, we talked a little bit about the defense with Urshela. It does appear that the Indians are trying to improve the defense. We'll get to the rotation in a minute. With this rotation, as good as it is Napoli really more important to us, as you mentioned, with Santana not being a great defender? Is Napoli more important to us defensively with the rotation that we have, especially when you consider, who we've had playing first base in the past and the brick hands that they've had? Could Napoli's biggest weapon be the fact that he can defend first base?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that was one of the things that, it's not quite, who was the guy that we had a couple years ago? There was a first baseman, Casey Kochman. It's not exactly Casey Kochman over there, but
that's who I was thinking of.
But I mean, he's a good first baseman, and I think that what Santana did over at first base, and I've been among Santana's biggest defenders. What he did at first base, when he was asked to be a first baseman, was just not a great effort, and not a lot of help to his pitchers, not a lot of help to the other infielders. And so if Napoli can bring, an aspect of defense to first base, which is supposed to be, anybody can play first base, which is, proven not to be true. That's huge for this team. And, that's, you put up with maybe some cold stretches for Napoli if he can continue to defend, as long as, again, as he's not Casey Kochman.
Boy, I hope he's not Casey Kochman. I almost think I should name the podcast "He's Not Casey Kochman." Boy, that is the absolute positive truth. Who is the player on this offensive team, aside from Francisco Lindor? It could be offensive or defensive or both. Who is the cog to you that mixes the drink? Now, we know this Indians team is kind of put together in a conglomeration that maybe isn't set up for one guy, and maybe Lindor is that guy. But is there another player, or maybe even a concoction of players that are super important to this team, both offensively and defensively?
I think it's Gomes. I mean, for as much as Perez, has proved that he can be better than a serviceable backup catcher, Gomes, what he was 2 years ago, both to the pitching staff as a right-handed bat that can be, hitting sixth, hitting seventh, really extending the lineup. That's huge. When he went down at the beginning of last year, I remember Francona at one point thought that he might be done for the season. And this was like 6 games. I don't even know how many games it was in. He's like, that's a season killer. And I thought, geez, that's a heck of a thing to say, less than 10 games into the season, to the rest of the players in the clubhouse. But I still think that Gomes is that important. You mentioned the snap throw, but the way that he can control the run game, the way that he can handle the pitching staff, the way that he can, provide a little extra pop. A lot of people forget what he did 2 years ago when he was a Silver Slugger as a catcher. If they get that back, that's enormous for the lineup.
Yeah, well, and I guess I was kind of alluding to that. I mean, if Yan Gomes is healthy last year, do you think that the Indians borderline playoff team last year?
Probably. I mean, they certainly weren't going to catch the Royals, but they could. I think they were much more in the mix at the end of it, because I think that he would have not only gotten them a little further, a couple more wins in the win column, but I think they also would have made the moves with Bourne and Swisher earlier. And I think that they would have, been a little bit more in contention, and maybe would have been a little bit more aggressive with some of the other moves that they had made or didn't make.
Well, I mean, you got to give it to Chris Antonetti on that deal. I mean, I can't even remember the pitcher's name who they traded to get him. They get this
Rogers.
guy. Yeah, yeah. I mean, think about that deal. They get Gomes and Aviles, and Aviles did serve. I mean, you can rip on Aviles all you want. He did serve a purpose with his club for 3 years. But Gomes, here's this guy who, played a little bit of third base, played a little bit of first base. They kind of plugged in the outfield here and there and caught a little bit. And they've turned him into a potential Gold Glove, Silver Slugger catcher. Hopefully he can stay healthy this year. I think the interesting thing about last year, you mentioned Roberto Perez, is they did find out that they had a valuable resource in Roberto Perez. I found it interesting that they didn't try to deal him this offseason. But, again, we talk about depth. They're rich in depth at second or at catcher. But, man, Yan Gomes is a guy that, maybe we don't overlook here in Cleveland, but certainly seems to get overlooked in the national media. They want to talk about Kipnis and Brantley, and they want to talk about, of course, Francisco Lindor. And we'll get to the rotation in a second. But Gomes certainly is a big piece of the puzzle. All right. So let's talk about the rotation. And honestly, the most fun for me isn't the top three. We'll get to those guys in a second. Let's start with 4 and 5. So we've got Cody Anderson and we've got Josh Tomlin. And Paul, I have no idea on your thoughts on these guys. I mean, does it make sense to you that these are the 4 and 5? Cody Anderson looked pretty good the other day in his first start and was absolutely spectacular in September last year. And the interesting thing to me about Cody Anderson last year, he was great to start, struggled, got injured, came back, and with teams starting to figure him out, overcame that and was awesome again in this bookend sort of way. He looked okay in the spring, nothing special, but has this all of a sudden uptick in velocity in 2 to 3 miles per hour. He's throwing the ball between 94 and 96 now, whereas before he was throwing between 92 and 93. What do you make of Cody Anderson? I mean, is this a guy who has figured out how to work himself into shape, picked up all of this velocity, and is all of a sudden going to be a solid 3-4 guy for the Indians? Or is it much ado about nothing? I mean, should Bauer be in there? What are your thoughts on Anderson? And then is kind of an offshoot to this. Is Josh Tomlin in the rotation because of the contract, or is he in the rotation because Terry Francona had the foresight to know that April was going to be a messy month?
I think with Anderson, I think that it could be real, and I know that's kind of hedging, but I remember last year we were up in Milwaukee visiting my in-laws, and we went to an Indians-Brewers game, and Anderson had been phenomenal up to that point, and that was the game that he kind of turned into a pumpkin. And my brother-in-law, who's a big baseball fan, he's like, so is that it for him? I'm like, gosh, I hope not, because he at least could be a mid to back rotation guy, but maybe that's it. And then I think it came out that he was injured, and he just kind of didn't. You thought, oh, is this going to be like a Scott Lewis guy where he comes up and he pitches well for a while, but you never hear from him again. But then he came back in September, and like you said, it's one of those things that if the league has adjusted to him and he can make that adjustment, I mean, that's something. He's 95% ahead of what most other pitchers do who struggle after a little early success. And so I think it could be real. I mean, I'm not ready to say that he's up in the upper echelon of the other three, and it's going to take him for a long time to pitch that well to get up there. But it certainly seems like he has that potential. Whether he is the Jake Westbrook of this staff, where he's a guy who sits there and eats innings, and maybe he pitches to contact a little bit if it's not so much ground balls. That's huge to have for a team like the Indians, who honestly need to have some cost controlled arms in the rotation, and certainly do right now, but need to continue to have those guys filtering through. I think that the crazy thing to think about is that where these guys are coming from. I remember when Salazar got rostered and they put him on the 40-man roster. I think that was the first time I had ever heard of Danny Salazar's name, and he was coming off of an injury, and I think he was in single A or maybe double A.
Yeah. He was just about to make his first run with Carolina when they were. I want to say that was the year he pitched in Carolina. I got to see him, and that was the year they started off with that. They throw him like 2 innings. Then they threw him like 3 innings.
Okay.
Then they threw him like 4 innings. It was right before that. And really he had made no splash whatsoever because of that Tommy John.
Right, but same thing with Anderson. I mean, you sit there and look at prospect lists, and Cody Anderson, was on them, but he certainly wasn't, up in the upper echelon where you used to be looking at, Adam Miller and Jeremy Sowers and David Huff, like, oh, these guys are it. This is it. And Cody Anderson just keeps plugging along.
He was an outfielder. He was an outfielder in college, and they literally I think in his junior year moved him to a reliever. He was literally a reliever in college,
Wow.
and they turned him into this star. Yeah, I mean it's insane. Well, and the interesting thing about Cody Anderson is the Devil Ray, the Rays. I still call them the Devil Rays. Sue me, but the Rays drafted him the year before the Indians did. And perhaps that was one of those things where Antonetti was paying attention a little bit to that, maybe pulled him out. But yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? I mean, so Cody Anderson does kind of follow along in those lines. Do you think that the upside is there?
I think the upside is there. I think that the question is going to be how the league adjusted to him. He adjusted to the league. Now they're going to adjust to him. How he continues to evolve as a pitcher. I think the other thing is that as a fourth starter, they're not going to be expecting for him to post an ERA under 3 or anything like that. If he settles in around a 4 ERA and can eat up some innings, he's going to be there for a long time. Which brings us to the guy that's behind him in Tomlin. And I think that Tomlin is one of those guys that he's almost like a safety blanket for Francona, where he's started before, he's relieved before. He doesn't seem to be affected by his role, where they can have him out of the bullpen if they need to for 3 innings. They can have him out of the, rotation, or if the weather is crazy as it's been, you have him as the 5th starter, but you have him throw some side sessions, and he just seems to keep performing. I've never been a huge Josh Tomlin fan in that unlike Anderson, the upside's just not there. He kind of is what he is, but as a 5th starter, there's a heck of a lot worse you could do than that. I do think that part of coming out of the spring training with Anderson and Tomlin, I don't know if it was a shot across the bow of Trevor Bauer, but it was at least a notice that, hey, just because you are Trevor Bauer doesn't mean that you get presented a rotation spot on the basis of your pedigree or your draft status or anything like that.
Which is a good thing. I mean,
right.
I think the interesting thing about the rotation as it is the depth that it has. We mentioned 4 or 5, and you mentioned Bauer. Past Bauer, you've got, TJ House, sitting in the minors at Columbus. You've got, Mike Clevenger, who, they make the deal. I forget who they sent to the Anaheim to get. Yeah, is it Pistano? You bring in Clevenger, and Clevenger has a great start on Sunday. Looked great in camp. Looked great last year. He's got a nice plus arm. It looks like a guy who they believe in, and could be in that Anderson / Salazar mold, and is kind of a guy that they bring along, maybe bring up sometime in July, maybe even earlier. You also, and I mentioned TJ House as a lefty, an interesting guy that's coming up there. And then you've got other interesting names like Pleitko, who, is in Columbus as well, who, certainly doesn't throw very hard, but again, could be another one of those, Tomlin sort of guys who can log in some innings if need be. Paul, we've been fans of this team for a long, long time. And, we've seen some great pitchers in CC Sabathia and, of course, Cliff Lee, and, here and there, some other guys like Fausto Carmona / Roberto Hernandez, whatever you want to call them these days. But is this maybe this is the obvious question, but, when you're a fan of a team for as long as we have been, and when you've looked for starters, obviously this is probably the deepest you've ever seen a rotation go. How good do you think this rotation is? Looking top to bottom, and I guess we can kind of talk about the top end as well. Is this a rotation you're fully confident in throughout this year? And cost effective. It seems to be a dream come true. It's cost effective. It's deep. We've got aces at the top, and I say aces plural, which makes me giddy, and I almost want to get up and dance. You talk about Salazar, and you already, and of course, we haven't even mentioned Kluber and just touched upon Carrasco a little bit. But the depth seems real. It seems like we've got a rotation that no matter what, I'm going to knock on wood, could withstand a season. We've got the depth, we've got the arms, we've got cannons, we've got lefties, we've got soft tossers, and we've got defense. Is this too good to be true, or are we really looking at one of the best rotations in the league?
I think we're looking at one of the best rotations in the league, and I think that oftentimes people talk about the edges of the roster, or they complain about who the utility infielder is, or the fifth pitcher, or anything like that, because you start to take for granted what's happening has happened at the top of the rotation, where you have Kluber and Carrasco and Salazar going out there every single series basically, and that's every team's dream. I mean, you talk about when July comes, teams are sitting there and they look for another starter, because if they make it to the playoffs, they want to have that third starter, to start the third playoff game. The Indians seem to have that, and they seem to have that locked in for a while. And so if they truly can, keep these guys healthy and keep, some semblance of offense around them, it seems like they built this thing very methodically and in a way that not a lot of us saw coming. I remember a couple years ago thinking, all right, so where are the arms coming from? We got Masterson, and I suppose you got Carrasco, but where's the rest of the arms coming from? That was only like 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Leading out that maybe 2014 season, where we sat there and looked at a rotation. We're like, oh God, this is going to be interesting. Especially if they let Masterson walk, and then all of a sudden, Kluber happens, and then all of a sudden Carrasco gets on a run, and all of a sudden Salazar becomes who he is. And as long as that doesn't go away, as long as that is not fleeting, it certainly seems to be built in a way to put up with maybe not great offense, maybe a flawed team otherwise. But I think that teams in the past couple of years have showed us, if you can have that really strong top of the rotation, the rest of the pieces don't have to be perfect, and everything else can kind of fall into place.
Well, think about how the stat, it's kind of funny. Is there a better story in baseball than Carlos Carrasco? Think about this. He starts pitching well way back in 2011. And if you remember, he had that big month. I think it was a big June. Started to struggle a bit in July. Ended up, getting suspended, threw out his arm, had to have Tommy John. Comes back, struggles. He had the game where I forget who he beamed in the head.
Oh, yeah, right.
For the Yankees, gets suspended again, gets moved to the bullpen, and now all of a sudden, not only has he rebounded with a big September after they moved him to the pen, but he obviously turns down a lot more money. He pisses off his agent. He fires up the Players Association. He signs this long-term deal with Cleveland for sticking with him. He's clearly one of the, I guess you can argue this point, he's probably one of the top 10 or 15 arms in maybe all of baseball, certainly in the American League. I mean, is there a better story than Carlos Carrasco? This guy is, if you would have told me 3 years ago that he was going to be an ace and sign a 5-year deal that's team friendly, I would have laughed you out of the ballpark. I was calling for his head. I wanted him gone. Right. Thank God they don't listen to me. But is there a better story in baseball? This is what underdog is all about, right? This is a Cleveland story.
For sure. And a lot of people, seem to take him for granted almost overnight, where they're like, oh well, Carrasco is almost our second ace. Well, that didn't just happen. Like you said, there was a lot of crazy things that were going on there with Carrasco, from getting fixed in the bullpen with Callaway to all of a sudden he kind of took off. And even then people were saying, well, we've seen this before, we saw this back in 2011, and he's a hothead, this will all fall apart. And it hasn't. And for as many people as how many years ago was the Cliff Lee deal, who said, oh, they got 4 middling prospects and they took quantity over quality. The other guys flamed out for sure, some a lot sooner than others. But Carrasco, when they traded Sabathia and Lee, they got Brantley and they got Carrasco. You wouldn't have thought that, when the deals were made, but that's who they ended up with. And, they ended up being right about the stuff.
If think about that, if those aren't if they're not the anchors of the team, they certainly are latched onto the anchors. Obviously I think you say Kluber is the number one guy in the rotation, but I think you can make a case for Carrasco, and it's offensively, it'd be hard pressed not to say Brantley's not the cog in that offense, just for his IQ and his approach. It's funny, those two deals, I want to say 2009, right? Think about that. That's 7 years ago. They make that deal, and what we get out of it are really kind of the linchpins to our entire team. Think about do we pay Callaway enough? I mean, if you think about it, I mean, and you mentioned Jan Gomes, and he certainly plays a part in this. But I mean, think about this: Corey Kluber. When Corey Kluber was brought over, he was a struggling, starter for San Diego. He comes over in that deal, and he can't find his way. He gets shelled in the minor leagues, and Callaway basically sits him down in the minor league, and in one day turns him around. He literally in one day. If you look at his minor league numbers, struggling, and then I think it was a game against Syracuse. I can't remember. He came back after one really bad start and one work session with Niebla and Callaway, and came back and has been the Corey Kluber that we know since then. Look at Danny Salazar, who has been called the head case in the past. A lot of people thought was going to be a two-pitch pitcher and perhaps get moved to the bullpen. Look at him now. You just mentioned Carrasco. Look at Cody Anderson. Is this guy like do we pay him enough? Is he going to leave to be a manager somewhere? Are the Indians just going to pay him millions and millions of dollars to be our pitching coach? Does he get enough praise? Is Mickey Callaway the savior of the Cleveland Indians?
It makes you wonder, and the way that all these guys kind of, like we said, came out of nowhere. I mean, Kluber again was in the Westbrook deal, but I remember when they traded Westbrook, I was like, who did they get? This Corey Kluber? This guy's like a 5 ERA in AAA. This is insane. But I don't know what he's figured out. I think a lot of teams have found the value of pitching coaches. There was a lot of talk before the season about the Pirates pitching coach, Ray Searage. And, there's always talk of Don Cooper in Chicago. Yep, and, sure. if you can have a guy like that where, or even what they used to do in St. Louis, where they'd get these guys that, Dave Duncan would teach them how to, throw, I can't remember which pitch it was, but to throw a certain pitch, and it, all of a sudden Jaime Garcia is, a number 2 starter. There is value in there. And, I don't know how much he gets paid, but I certainly hope that, he's going to stick around whether or not, regardless of who comes through the rotation of the bullpen.
Well, it has been absolutely. If you'd have told me that Corey Kluber is a Cy Young winner, finished 9th last year, is the ace of the staff, and I spent a good deal of time mocking him when he was pitching in Columbus. So, hopefully people don't either listen to this or go back and look at my Twitter account, because I could be in some trouble.
Right.
All right. So to you, I guess this is kind of a fluffy topic. I'm going to go ahead and just throw it out there. Do you think that any of these guys are going to win? Who's the best of the 3 this year, do you think? You've got the money guy and Kluber, who's already won the Cy Young. You've got the up-and-coming guy, Carrasco, who at times last year probably was the ace of the staff. And then you've got this young gun who's touched 100, who has learned a curveball and is slowly but surely learning how to pitch, not just throw hard. Of these top 3 guys, is there one that you either like the best or that you think the best, or both?
I've always been a Carrasco fan. I don't know if that's just, the knee-jerk reaction to the Indians being raked over the coals for the Lee deal, and me, the fanboy in me saying like, haha, look at this. They actually, did net something from the Cliff Lee deal. But I think that Carrasco has I don't want to say the easiest looking stuff, but Kluber certainly has that control, and Salazar has that electricity. But with Carrasco, it seems like he could go out there and throw a no-hitter every night, and it doesn't seem like he's ever laboring with it. It doesn't ever seem like it's, I don't want to say hard, but it doesn't ever seem like he's out of control of the game, which is unbelievable to think of when you think about, when he used to be throwing at people's heads, and he was throwing at people's heads. I mean, it wasn't slipping. He was a head case out there. And so now suddenly, he's able to lock in and just goes.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's, you got to give the guy credit. I've never seen such a turnaround. I mean, he seemed to always have, here and there, you'd see some of that magic, but the fact that he got his head on straight, whatever the Indian, and then to top it off, you always have to like a guy who, wants to play in Cleveland, and it's clear he did. And that's a rare thing these days where a guy says, you know what, you stuck with me, I'm going to stick with you. So, the cost-controlled part of this rotation is what's going to be interesting in the next 2 to 3 years to see if the Indians can take advantage of that, maybe sign a player or I don't know, develop a couple of more players to kind of fit that. It would be absolutely horrific if they don't take advantage of this pitching staff. All right, so we're going to wind things up, Paul. I don't want to keep you too much because I want to ask you back on, and I don't want to annoy you too much in our first podcast, but I do want to ask one more question. I'm not going to ask you for wins and losses, and I'm not going to ask you if they're going to win the division or aren't going to division. A nice, simple, straight-up question. Do you think the Cleveland Indians, even without Brantley right now, even without Chisenhall right now, with some obvious holes and typical, I think, Cleveland flaws, will this Cleveland Indian, I got to have some solidity here. I don't want to leave anything left to be desired, so I can come back to this podcast at some point and, tweet it out and say, see, Paul was right. Not wrong, right. Are the Indians going to make the playoffs this year?
I think that they do. I think that I don't know if they win their division. I think they'll make the playoffs. I think that the AL is going to be so tightly bunched, unlike the NL, which seems to have a couple of elite teams and a couple of teams that just look to be awful. I think that the AL is going to be pretty tightly bunched in terms of teams that have anywhere from 82 to 88, 90 wins, and I think the Indians are going to be in that mix. I think it's going to be interesting to see what they do in July, if they do anything, whether that means a Bradley Zimmer comes up, whether that means that they everybody compares them to the Mets of last year with the pitching staff, and the Mets obviously added Cespedes. I don't know if they've got that in them. It's going to be fascinating to watch. The big thing to watch right now is to make sure that they don't dig themselves a hole that they simply are digging out of for the whole rest of the year. And as long as they can weather the storm when Brantley's gone and when Chisenhall's gone, and they've got these kind of pieced together lineups, as long as they can, maybe hit Memorial Day somewhere around 500, I think they got a pretty good chance.
Well, and based on past Aprils, if they're 500 at Memorial Day, I think we're good to go. I mean,
Right.
I don't know. This team to me feels different. I mean, last year the outfield was dreadful, and we had Moss and we had Swisher and we had Bourne, and they, you've got to give the front office credit. They've found a way to get out from under some of these players, and while they're still paying some of them money, Swisher is playing for the Yankees and we're still paying for it, but it's interesting. It's an interesting mix, and if they can get a healthy Brantley back and they can get Chisenhall, and if Chisenhall wasn't just a 1 month flash in the pan in right field, it's going to be interesting defensively, especially. So, especially with this rotation, I feel we're going to probably win a lot of 3-2 games, but who knows? Maybe we'll get a special year from Kipnis and not just one really great month and a really good month and then him dying out in September. Maybe Kipnis can be the guy. We haven't even talked about him, but we'll save that for later. We got to save some things to talk about. Listen, Paul, I don't want to keep you. I know, both of us have a lot to do. First of all, thanks a lot for coming. I know you don't have anything to plug. That's got to be a huge thing. But, first of all, thanks for joining us. I mean, is there anything you want to leave us with? I suspect I'll probably be shooting you an email in a month or so to see if I can get you to do this again. But is there anything you want to leave us with in your return to the Cleveland scene, even if it's brief?
No, I would just say that the one thing that I've learned from kind of taking a step away is that you kind of regain the sense of being a fan, where it sometimes you get to be a little. I got to be overly analytical, and I'd sit there and moan about Aaron Cunningham or whoever else, and if you sit there and you actually just kind of enjoy these games and enjoy baseball for what it is, maybe it's a matter of having a couple of boys that I sit here and watch the games with, to try to retain some positivity and not always sit there and complain if Lindor is bunting again, or if these things are happening. But it's it's a diversion, it's fun, and I think that's the whole reason that we became baseball fans, and that kind of sense of joy and wonder. That's the one thing that I still somehow retained, and I'm glad that I did.
Well, it's good. It definitely is good. I do miss your writing, but it's good to hear you say that. And I having a son myself, and it is a lot of fun to kind of watch the game through his eyes. Is sometimes watching it through my 44-year-old eyes is a little too jaded for myself. But
right.
It really was good. It really was good to have you back, Paul, and hopefully we'll see you back. Maybe not real soon. I don't want to kill this, so I'll give you some time off, but I'll start hitting you up again in a month or so.
It's my pleasure, Jim. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, we'll talk to you soon. And those of you following the podcast again, hit iTunes, give us a rating, rate this one, and we'll be back real soon. Go Tribe.